Before we step into the darkness, do one thing, like this video. It may seem small, but it helps keep these stories alive. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and stay close, because you don't want to face what lurks in the unknown alone. And if you've lived through a real horror, tell your story in the comments. Who knows? It might just resurface here and haunt us all. My name is Nathan Carter. I'm 28 years old, and I've been a park ranger at Silver Pines National Park for the past 3 years. I chose this job because I wanted peace, time away from the noise of the city, away from the chaos I carried with me after my time as a military medic. The woods were supposed to be my sanctuary, but now I'm not sure if I'll ever feel safe here again. I'm writing this message to you because I need someone to hear this, someone who might believe me. I've seen things out here, things I can't explain, things I don't want to believe myself. I thought I could handle the isolation, the wild animals, even the occasional tragedy that comes with the job. But this is different. Something is out here in these woods, something that doesn't belong, and it's getting bolder. It started with the howls. At first, I thought it was just the wind. Silver Pines is a sprawling wilderness, thousands of acres of dense forest, jagged cliffs, and misty valleys. The kind of place that swallows sound and plays tricks on your senses. But these howls, they weren't natural. They didn't sound like wolves or coyotes. They were deeper, guttural, almost human, but twisted somehow. The first time I heard them, I was on a routine patrol near Pine Hollow, a remote area that most visitors avoid. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I remember stopping to catch my breath, leaning against a pine that towered above me like a cathedral column. That's when I heard it, a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo from every direction. I radioed back to the station, asking if anyone else had heard it. Karen, one of the older rangers, just laughed it off. "Probably a bobcat," she said, her voice crackling through the static. "They scream like banshees this time of year. Don't let it spook you." But it wasn't a bobcat. I know the sounds animals make. This was something else. The next day, a tourist showed up at the station, pale and shaking. He claimed he'd been hiking along the Ridgeway Trail when he felt like he was being followed. "I kept hearing footsteps," he said, his voice trembling. "But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Then I found these scratches on the trees. Huge ones. My claws." I offered to check it out, thinking it might be a bear. But when I reached the spot he described, I found something stranger. The claw marks were there, all right. 4 deep gashes running down the trunk of an old oak. They were too large for any black bear in the area, and the spacing between the marks was off, like whatever made them had an unnatural reach. As I stood there, studying the marks, the woods went silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an impressive, suffocating quiet. I felt it then, the same thing the tourists must have felt. The sensation of being watched. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. I sat in the ranger station, staring at the map of Silver Pines spread across my desk. My coffee had gone cold. I kept replaying the day in my head, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear, or maybe someone was out there, trying to scare people. But then I remembered the howls. Around midnight, I decided to take another look at the old reports we kept in the back office. Silver Pines had a history, after all, a long one. The park had been established in the early 1900s, but before that, it was home to settlers and, before them, the indigenous tribes who considered parts of the forest sacred. Over the years, there had been whispers of disappearances, strange sightings, and unexplained phenomena. I found one report from the 1980s that stuck with me. A ranger named Harris had written it. He described finding a campsite abandoned, the tents shredded, and the ground littered with tracks that led nowhere. His final note read, "Something isn't right here. The woods feel wrong." That was the last entry he ever made. Harris disappeared a week later. I don't know why I'm telling you all this. Maybe I just need someone to understand, to know that I'm not crazy. I'll admit, there's a part of me that wants to pack up and leave, to run as far from these woods as I can. But I can't, because yesterday, we found another body. It was a young man this time, mid-20s. He'd been reported missing 2 days earlier. When we found him, he was lying at the base of a ravine, his body mangled and torn. The wounds weren't consistent with a fall. They looked like bite marks, only they didn't match any animal we've ever seen. As I stood over his body, that same silence fell over the woods. And then, faintly, I heard it again. The hell. Whatever is out here, it's not done yet. And neither am I. The wind was colder that night, sharper, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. It clung to the back of my throat, bitter and metallic, like rusted iron. I didn't want to go back to Pine Hollow. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in the station, to lock the doors, turn on every light, and wait for morning. But something wouldn't let me. Maybe it was the bodies, the way their lifeless faces haunted me every time I closed my eyes. Or maybe it was that primal, gnawing need to know, to understand what was out there, lurking beyond the reach of our flashlights, watching us from the suffocating dark. Karen's words echoed in my mind as I loaded the gear into my truck. "You can't fix what you don't understand," Keith said, her tone grim, her eyes hard. She didn't believe me, not entirely, but I could see it in her face. She was afraid too. As I drove toward Pine Hollow, the headlights carved pale tunnels through the towering trees. Shadows danced and stretched, flickering like ghosts caught mid-movement. The radio crackled faintly in the background, the static almost comforting. I told myself this was just another patrol. Nothing special. Nothing out of the ordinary. But deep down, I knew better. The trailhead loomed ahead, shrouded in mist that clung to the earth like a living thing. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching against the gravel, and immediately the silence hit me. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a void. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the faint whisper of the wind through the pines. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I adjusted my flashlight, its beam cutting through the fog in uneven arcs, and started down the trail. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth beneath me was conspiring to pull me under. The trees stood like sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. And then I saw it, a glint of something on the ground, barely visible in the dim light. I crouched down, my breath fogging the air, and picked it up. It was a necklace, a delicate chain broken, with a small pendant in the shape of a star. My stomach tightened. I recognized it immediately. The missing tourist's girlfriend had described it to me earlier, tears streaming down her face. "He gave it to me," she'd sobbed. "He never took it off." I stood, scanning the trees, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. The shadows seemed thicker now, pressing closer, shifting just beyond the edge of my vision. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate the ground beneath my feet. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever encountered. Not a bear, not a wolf. It was something other. I swung the flashlight in the direction of the sound, my fingers tightening around the grip, but there was nothing. Just more trees, their trunks gnarled and ancient. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. Silence. I swallowed hard, my breath quickening. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the faintest rustle of leaves. My mind raced, every nerve screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I reached for the knife strapped to my belt. It felt small, almost laughably so, but it was all I had. The growl turned into a sound I can only describe as laughter, deep, throaty, and utterly inhuman. My blood turned to ice as a shadow moved at the edge of the flashlight's beam, too fast to track. "Show yourself," I shouted, the words tearing from my throat like a command. And then it did. Just for a moment, a shape materialized in the fog, tall, hunched, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing faintly like embers. It didn't look at me. It looked through me, as though I were nothing more than an insect beneath its notice. My breath hitched as it tilted its head, almost curious, before vanishing into the mist. I don't remember how I made it back to the truck. One moment I was standing there, frozen in terror, and the next, I was slamming the door shut, my hands trembling as I fumbled to start the engine. The drive back to the station was a blur. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it chasing me, its glowing eyes piercing the dark. But the road behind me remained empty. When I finally staggered into the station, Karen was waiting for me, her face pale. "What the hell happened to you?" she demanded, but I couldn't find the words to answer. Instead, I handed her the necklace, my fingers still shaking. She didn't say anything, just stared at it, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. "This thing," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's not just an animal. It's haunting us." Karen didn't respond. She didn't have to. Because somewhere out there, deep in the suffocating dark of Silver Pines, it was waiting. And I knew it wasn't done. There are moments in life when fear grips you so tightly, you can barely breathe. And then, there are moments when that fear transforms into something else, determination. The kind that burns away everything else, leaving only purpose. That's what I felt as I packed my gear that night. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't heroism. It was desperation. I couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was out there wouldn't stop. Not until it had taken more lives. Not until it had devoured this place whole. And if no one else would face it, then I would. I spread the old Ranger journal across the desk, tracing the faded ink with my finger. Harris had written about a clearing deep in the restricted zone, a place he called the Part of the Pines. His words were cryptic. The forest grows headier there. Something waits, something ancient. It was my only lead. Karen tried to stop me when I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight. "You're going to get yourself killed," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe," I replied, slinging the rifle over my shoulder. "But if I don't, who will?" She didn't argue. She just handed me a flare gun and whispered, "Don't let it take you." The drive to the edge of the restricted zone was silent. The forest seemed to press against the truck, the trees casting skeletal shadows that reached for me like claws. I parked at the end of the dirt road, stepped out into the cold night, and adjusted my pack. The trail ahead was faint, almost non-existent, overgrown with tangled roots and 40 bushes. It felt like the forest itself didn't want me to go any further. I pushed on. The deeper I went, the thicker the air became. It was oppressive, suffocating, as though the trees were exhaling something ancient and foul. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness, its beam swallowed by the mist that clung to the ground. And then I found it. The clearing. It wasn't what I expected. It was wrong. The trees formed a perfect circle around a patch of bare earth, their trunks twisted and blackened as if burned. In the center stood a ring of stones, each one carved with strange, angular symbols that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. The air was colder here, and the silence was absolute. Even my own footsteps sounded muted, as though the earth itself was absorbing the sound. That's when I heard it. A low rumbling growl. so deep it seemed to vibrate through my chest. I froze, my fingers tightening around the rifle. The growl came again, closer this time, and I turned slowly, scanning the edge of the clearing. It was there, standing just beyond the tree line, its form barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its body hunched and grotesque. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin embers burning in the void. It didn't move. Not at first. It just watched me, its head tilting ever so slightly, as it studied me. I raised the rifle, aiming for its chest. My hands were steady, my breath slow. "Stay back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It didn't stay back. In an instant, it lunged, its speed unnatural, its movements a blur. I fired, the gunshot echoing through the clearing, but it didn't stop. The bullet hit it, I was sure of it, but the thing barely flinched. I stumbled back, firing again and again, the recoil jolting my arms. It was like trying to stop a storm with pebbles. The creature was on me before I could react, its clawed hand slashing through the air. I threw myself to the ground, the impact driving the breath from my lungs. Scrambling to my feet, I reached for the flare gun, my fingers fumbling with the cold metal. It charged again, and I fired the flare. The brilliant red light illuminated the clearing, casting monstrous shadows that writhed and twisted. The creature recoiled, its growl turning into a screech, its glowing eyes narrowing against the sudden brightness. It was afraid of the light. That's when I saw it, the stones in the center of the clearing. They pulsed faintly, their symbols glowing in rhythm with the creature's movements. It wasn't just lurking here, it was tied to this place. I didn't think. I acted. Grabbing a rock from the edge of the clearing, I ran to the stone circle, dodging the creature's swipes as it lunged for me. The air seemed to thicken, each step harder than the last, but I kept going. With a primal scream, I smashed the rock against one of the carved stones. The symbol shattered, and the ground beneath me trembled. The creature howled, a sound so raw and piercing it felt like it would split me in two. It clawed at the air, its body convulsing, shrinking, twisting. One by one, I shattered the stones, each blow sending shockwaves through the clearing. By the time I destroyed the last one, the creature was gone, its form dissolving into the mist, its howls fading into the night. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, the silence rushing back like a tidal wave. The clearing was empty now, the stones reduced to rubble, the symbols gone, but the forest still felt wrong. I staggered back to the truck as dawn broke over the horizon, the first rays of light cutting through the mist. When I returned to the station, Karen was waiting for me. I didn't tell her everything, just enough. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice small. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe it. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some things can't be destroyed. As I turned to leave, I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible. A low growl, carried on the wind. It was still out there, waiting. If you're listening to this, then you already know too much. But if I don't tell you, who will? 3 days after that thing called my name in the clearing, I made a choice. It wasn't the smart choice, or the safe one, but it was the only thing I could do. I had to go back. The nights hadn't gotten any quieter. The voice followed me everywhere, soft, persistent, just loud enough to keep me from sleeping. Sometimes it was Daniel's. Sometimes it was Karen. And sometimes it was my own. "Joey," it would whisper, "why didn't you save me?" I started carrying the flare gun with me everywhere. A rifle didn't seem like enough anymore, not after what I saw. Karen tried to stop me when she saw the gear I was packing. "You're not going back out there," she said, standing in the doorway of the station. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I have to," I replied, my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. "That's not bravery," she said, her eyes glistening with something close to fear. "It's suicide." "Maybe," I said, rushing past her. "But if I don't end this, it won't stop." She didn't argue. She just handed me a small radio, her fingers brushing mine for a moment. "Keep this on," she said. "Don't make me lose another ranger." The drive to Death Basin was different this time. The road seemed longer, darker, as if the forest itself was trying to warn me away. When I reached the trailhead, the truck's engine sputtered and died. I stared at the dashboard, my pulse quickening. The gas gauge was full. The battery was fine. But the truck wouldn't start again. It didn't matter. I wasn't planning on coming back that way. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my face, and adjusted my pack. The rifle was slung over my shoulder, the flared gun at my hip. "Joey," the wind whispered. I didn't look back. The trail to the clearing felt shorter this time, as if the forest was pulling me in. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches tangling above me to block out the faint moonlight. My flashlight beam wavered, the shadows around me twisting and shifting like they were alive. And then I was there. The clearing looked the same, but there was something different in the air, a heaviness, like the ground itself was breathing. The stones in the cedar glowed faintly, their carvings pulsing with a sickly light. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. That's when I saw it. Daniels, or what was left of him. He was standing in the center of the clearing, his back to me, his uniform torn and blood-stained. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Daniels?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and black. When he smiled, it wasn't human. It was too wide, the corners of his mouth stretching unnaturally. "You came back," he said, his voice layered with something deeper, something ancient. I raised the rifle, aiming for his chest. "What are you?" His grin widened. "You know what I am." Behind him, the shadows moved. The figure I'd seen before stepped out of the darkness, its limbs impossibly long, its eyes glowing like embers. It didn't speak this time. It didn't have to. I fired. The shot echoed through the clearing, but the thing barely flinched. It stepped closer, its movement smooth, almost fluid. I fired again and again, but the bullets passed through it like smoke. The flared gun. My fingers fumbled as I pulled it from my hip, loading a single flare into the chamber. The creature was almost on me now, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Joey," it said, but the voice wasn't its own. It was my mother's. I fired. The flare shot forward, a brilliant arc of red light that struck the creature in the chest. It screamed, a sound so raw and primal it felt like the earth itself was splitting open. The stones in the center of the clearing began to crack, their light flickering and fading. The creature writhed, its form twisting and contorting as the glow in its eyes dimmed. But it wasn't gone. Not yet. The ground beneath me trembled as I ran to the circle of stones. They were ancient, worn smooth by time, but the carvings still pulsed faintly. I grabbed a rock and swung it down onto the nearest stone. The carving shattered, and the creature screamed again, its form flickering like a dying flame. One by one, I destroyed the stones, each blow sending shockwaves through the clearing. By the time I smashed the last one, the creature was gone. The clearing was silent, the air heavy with the scent of burnt wood. I stood there for a long time, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. It was over. At least, that's what I told myself. When I made it back to the station, Karen was waiting for me. "You look like hell," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I feel worse," I replied, collapsing into a chair. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. But as I sat there, staring out the window, I heard it again, Faint. Distant. Joey! The voice wasn't coming from the wood this time. It was coming from inside the station.